Hello, everyone here on the Fear Files channel. Today, we're diving into one of the most mysterious and tragic stories in the history of American cults. We're talking about a group that called itself Heaven's Gate and the events that ended with the mass suicide of 39 people in March 1997. This is a story about faith, manipulation, spaceships, and how ordinary people can come to the decision to leave this world together. On March 26, 1997, San Diego police received an anonymous call. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, almost emotionless. The caller reported that something terrible had happened at a mansion in the upscale Rancho Santa Fe neighborhood. When officers arrived at the scene, they discovered a picture impossible to forget. 39 bodies, neatly arranged on beds and bunk beds, covered with purple shrouds. Everyone was dressed in identical black clothing and new Nike sneakers. Each had $5 and some change in their pocket. This was not an act of violence. This was a carefully planned, collective decision to leave their physical shells. But how did this happen? What led these people to such an end? To understand this, we need to go back to the early 70s, when two strangers met and created one of the most unusual religious movements of the 20th century. Marshall Applewhite was born in 1931 in Texas. His father was a Presbyterian minister, and Marshall grew up in a strict religious atmosphere. He was a talented musician, studied music in college, and even taught it. He had a wife, 2 children, quite a prosperous life. But something inside him gave him no peace. Marshall realized his homosexuality at a time when it was extremely stigmatized, especially in religious circles. His marriage fell apart. He lost his job at the university due to inappropriate relations with a student. Applewhite was in deep depression, searching for answers to questions about the meaning of life and his place in the world. In the early 70s, after a nervous breakdown, he ended up in a psychiatric clinic in Houston. It was there that the meeting that changed everything took place. He met Bonnie Lou Nettles, a nurse who worked at this hospital. Bonnie was 4 years older than Marshall. She had a husband, for children, but she too was looking for something more. She was interested in astrology, spiritualism, theosophy, all those things that in the 70s attracted many people disillusioned with traditional religions. An unusual connection arose between Marshall and Bonnie. They talked for hours about the Bible, space, aliens, spiritual evolution. They both felt that their meeting was not accidental. Gradually, they formed the belief that they were not ordinary people. They decided they were the 2 witnesses from the book of Revelation, the very ones who should come before the end of the world. They believed they had been sent by higher powers, representatives of the next evolutionary level, which they called the next level above human. In 1973, Marshall and Bonnie left everything. They abandoned their families, jobs, former lives. They began traveling across America, telling people about their mission. They called themselves different names. First Bo and Peep, then T and Do. Marshall was Do, Bonnie was T. They said they had come from a higher level of existence to take chosen people aboard a spacecraft that would carry them to eternal life in another dimension. Their message was a strange combination of Christianity, science fiction, and New Age ideas. They claimed that Jesus was a representative of the next level who came to Earth 2,000 years ago to show people the way. Now, they, T and Do, had returned to complete this mission. Earth, according to them, was a garden where souls capable of evolving to the next level were grown. But most people were stuck in animal instincts, attachments to the material world. Only those willing to give up everything earthly could rise higher. Surprisingly, Their message resonated. These were the 70s in America, a time of cultural upheaval, searching for alternative paths of spirituality. The Vietnam War had ended. The hippie movement was fading. Many felt disappointment and emptiness. Tea and Do attracted people who were searching for meaning, purpose, something greater than ordinary life. In 1975, they held a meeting in a small town in Oregon. About 200 people attended. T and Do talked about a spacecraft that would soon arrive and take everyone who was ready to leave Earth. They said everything had to be left behind: work, family, property, even one's name. They called this the process of renouncing the human level. About 24 people after this meeting decided to join T and Do. They simply disappeared, leaving their homes and loved ones. Newspapers wrote about this, calling the group a UFO cult. The relatives of the missing people were panicked. The group began living a nomadic life, moving around the country, stopping at campgrounds. They practiced strict asceticism. They were forbidden to consume alcohol, drugs, or smoke. Sex was absolutely prohibited. They had to rid themselves of all human attachments and desires. Group members wore uniforms, cut their hair short, gave up their former names, and took new ones, often consisting of combinations of letters and syllables. T and Do taught that the physical body is just a shell, a vehicle for the soul. Real life would only begin when they left these bodies and transitioned to the next level, where they would receive new, perfect bodies, not subject to disease and death. They call their bodies containers or vehicles. Life in the group was strictly regulated. Every day, scheduled down to the minute. Group members worked in pairs, watching each other so that no one would succumb to earthly temptations. They studied the teachings of T and Do, meditated, prepared for the transition. Personal life was absent. Even looking into each other's eyes for too long was considered a manifestation of human attachment. In 1985, an event occurred that shook Marshall Applewhite to the core. Bonnie Nettles, his partner, his T, died of liver cancer. For Marshall, this was an incredible blow. They believed their bodies would transform, that they would rise together to the spacecraft. Bonnie's death contradicted everything they taught, but Marshall did not abandon his beliefs. Instead, he reinterpreted the teaching. He told his followers that T had already transitioned to the next level, that she was waiting for them there. Now his mission became even more important. He had to leave the rest to her. After Bonnie's death, the group became even more closed. In the late 80s and early 90s, they practically disappeared from public view. They lived in rental houses in different states, supported themselves by doing computer work. Many of the group members were educated people with programming and web design skills. They created websites for clients, earned money, but continued to live together, following strict rules. In the mid-90s, the group began using the internet to spread their ideas. They created a website called Heaven's Gate, where they published texts about their teaching, video recordings with Marshall Applewhite. This was a time when the internet was just beginning to develop, and they were among the first religious groups to actively use this technology. New elements appeared in their teaching. Marshall began talking more about how Earth would soon be recycled, that the planet was at the end of its cycle. He claimed that representatives of the next level would soon take their students, but for this one had to be ready. Readiness meant complete rejection of human nature. Several group members, including Marshall Applewhite himself, decided on a radical step. They underwent surgical castration. For them, this was a way to finally get rid of sexual desires, of what connected them to the animal level of existence. Marshall believed this would help them become purer, closer to the ideal that exists at the next level. In 1995, a new surge of activity occurred in the group. They briefly emerged from the shadows, held several public meetings, tried to attract new members. But success was limited. Society had changed. The 90s were a different time, and UFO cult ideas no longer seemed as attractive as they had 20 years ago. Then an event occurred that became the last straw. In March 1997, Comet Hale-Bopp passed by Earth. It was a bright comet, visible to the naked eye, and it attracted enormous attention. On the internet and among paranormal enthusiasts, rumors began to spread that a huge spacecraft was following the comet. Of course, astronomers refuted these claims, but for Marshall Applewhite and his followers, this became a sign. Marshall announced to the group members that the ship had come for them. This was their chance to leave Earth and join T at the next level. But there was one problem. To get on the ship, they needed to leave their physical bodies. Death, according to their teaching, was not the end. It was just a transition, liberation of the soul from the shell. Marshall convinced his followers that suicide was not a sin, but a necessary step for ascension. For several days, they prepared. They recorded farewell video messages, in which each calmly explained their decision. They said they were happy that they would finally leave this world and transition to a new level of existence. They packed suitcases as if going on a trip. They tidied up the house they were renting in Rancho Santa Fe. On March 22, 1997, what they called the exit began. The process was divided into 3 groups. The first group of 15 people took a mixture of phenobarbital mixed with applesauce or pudding, washed it down with vodka. Phenobarbital is a powerful sedative. After this, they put plastic bags over their heads to speed up the process. The remaining group members helped them, laid them on beds, covered them with purple shrouds. Then came the turn of the second group, then the third. Marshall Applewhite was in the second group. By March 26th, all 39 people were dead. 2 group members who were not present at the mansion also later committed suicide, trying to join the others. They survived after the first attempt, but one of them, Wayne Cook, successfully committed suicide several months later in a hotel room, using the same method. When news of the mass suicide spread around the world, the reaction was one of shock. People couldn't understand how educated adults could believe in such ideas and voluntarily take their own lives. Among the deceased were programmers, designers, former teachers. One of the members was the brother of actress Nichelle Nichols from the Star Trek series. The relatives of the deceased were devastated. Many of them hadn't seen their loved ones in years. The cult isolated its members from the outside world from families. Some parents didn't even know where their children were. Now all they had left was to grieve and try to understand what went wrong. Psychologists and cult researchers began studying the Heaven's Gate phenomenon, trying to understand the mechanisms that led to such a tragedy. One of the key factors was the charisma of the leader. Marshall Applewhite was not a loud orator. He spoke quietly, almost monotonously, but he had a conviction that attracted people. He truly believed in what he said. This was not cynical manipulation for money or power. Marshall himself became a victim of his beliefs. He died along with his followers. Another factor is the gradual escalation of demands. When people first joined the group, they weren't required to give up everything immediately. The process was gradual. First small sacrifices, then increasingly larger ones. By the time they were offered to commit suicide, they were already so deeply mired in the teaching, so isolated from the outside world, that they simply saw no alternatives. Isolation played a huge role. Group members had almost no contact with people from outside. They lived together, worked together, all their social connections were within the group. This created a closed system where the teaching of tea and do was the only reality. There was no one who could offer a different point of view, who could question. It's also important to understand the psychological profile of people who joined Heaven's Gate. Many of them were at turning points in their lives. They were searching for meaning, purpose, a sense of belonging. The group offered them all of this. They gave them clear answers to complex questions, gave them a family, gave them a mission that seemed magnificent and important. The teaching of Heaven's Gate contained many apocalyptic elements. The idea that the world would soon end, that Earth would be recycled, created a sense of urgency. This wasn't something that could be postponed for later. If they didn't take advantage of the opportunity now, they might forever miss their chance for salvation. This psychological pressure pushed people toward making radical decisions. The role of the internet in the Heaven's Gate story also cannot be underestimated. They were among the first cults to actively use the network to spread their ideas. The internet allowed them to reach an audience around the world while remaining anonymous and isolated. Their site still exists, maintained by remaining followers. On it, you can find teaching texts, videos with group members, their farewell messages. Watching these videos makes a creepy impression. People sit in front of the camera, calmly, almost joyfully talking about their upcoming departure. They thank Du for showing them the way. They say they see no other way out, that this is the only way to achieve what they've been striving for all these years. There is no fear in their eyes, no doubt, only conviction. One of the women in the video says she will finally be able to get rid of her body, which she always considered a burden. Another man tells how happy he is that he found this group, because without it his life had no meaning. A young girl smiles and says she will soon see T, that they will all soon reunite on the ship. What's striking about these videos is the complete lack of understanding of what they are about to do. For them, death was not the end. It was a transition, transformation, the beginning of a new life. They didn't perceive it as suicide in the ordinary sense. For them, it was liberation, graduation, the final step in their spiritual journey. After the tragedy, many questions arose about whether this could have been prevented. Were there warning signs that were missed? Could authorities or relatives have done something? The truth is that Heaven's Gate members were adults who voluntarily chose this path. In America, religious freedom is protected by the Constitution, and as long as the group didn't break laws, authorities couldn't intervene. By the time it became clear what was happening, it was already too late. The Heaven's Gate story raised important questions about the nature of faith, freedom of choice, and the boundaries of religious freedom. Where is the line between a spiritual group and a dangerous cult? How do you protect people from manipulation without violating their right to believe what they want? There are no simple answers to these questions. Some researchers point out that Heaven's Gate was not a typical cult in the traditional sense. There was no physical violence, no sexual exploitation, no attempts to enrich the leader. Marshall Applewhite lived in the same conditions as his followers. He ate the same food, wore the same clothes, followed the same rules. He didn't accumulate wealth, didn't build an empire. In a sense, he was sincerely convinced of his mission. But this doesn't make what happened any less tragic. 39 people died, believing in a promise that could never be fulfilled. There was no spacecraft behind the comet. There was no next level waiting for them. There was only death. The relatives of the deceased are still trying to cope with the loss. Some of them have written books, given interviews, trying to understand how their loved ones got into the situation. One mother told how her son was a smart, talented young man, but after joining the group, he began to distance himself, become increasingly cold and detached. The last time she saw him, he seemed calm, even happy, but completely alien. The brother of one of the group members told how he tried to pull his sister out of the cult. He found her, talked to her, begged her to come home, but she refused. She said she had finally found her place, her purpose. She said he just didn't understand because he was stuck at the human level. That was the last time he spoke with her. The Heaven's Gate tragedy became a warning about how dangerous isolated groups with charismatic leaders and apocalyptic beliefs can be. It showed that education and intelligence don't protect against manipulation. Many group members had university degrees, successful careers before joining the cult. But in a moment of vulnerability, when they were searching for answers, they fell under the influence of a teaching that seemed true to them. There's another aspect of this story that's often forgotten. After the death of 39 people, several former group members who left before the tragedy or who weren't in the mansion at that moment continued to believe in the teaching of tea and dew. Two of them, as I already mentioned, committed suicide later. But there were also those who remained alive and still maintain the Heaven's Gate site, still believe that their friends successfully transitioned to the next level. This raises even more complex questions. If a person sincerely believes in something, do they have the right to act in accordance with that belief, even if it leads to their death? In Western society, we value individual freedom, each person's right to choose their path. But what if this choice destroys the person themselves? Philosophers and ethicists have been arguing about this for thousands of years. The Stoics of ancient Rome believed that a person has the right to choose the moment of their death if life becomes unbearable. Many religions, on the contrary, consider suicide a sin. In modern society, we allow euthanasia in some cases of terminal illness, but condemn the suicide of healthy people. The Heaven's Gate case is somewhere in the gray zone. These people were not physically ill. They weren't experiencing unbearable suffering, but they were convinced that their death was not the end, but a transition to a better life. They were convinced as strongly as a religious person is convinced of the existence of heaven. Can we say they were mentally ill? Some psychiatrists claim that any person who commits suicide is by definition suffering from a mental disorder. But others disagree. They say that faith, even the strangest and most illogical from our point of view, is not necessarily a sign of illness. Marshall Applewhite certainly had mental problems in the past. He was in a psychiatric hospital, suffered from depression. But in the last years of his life, he showed no signs of classic mental illnesses. He was organized, rational within his belief system, capable of functioning in society. His followers also weren't madmen. They worked, communicated, lived relatively normal lives, just following a strange religious doctrine. The Heaven's Gate story also makes us think about how our society creates conditions for the emergence of such groups. In the modern world, many people feel lost, isolated, devoid of meaning. Traditional institutions, religion, family, community are weakening. People search for belonging, search for answers to big questions about life and death. Cults offer simple answers, a sense of community, a clear purpose. This is attractive to those who feel lost. In the 70s, when Heaven's Gate was just emerging, America was experiencing a particularly turbulent period. Vietnam, Watergate, economic crisis, social upheavals. All this created an atmosphere of uncertainty and searching. Many turned to alternative forms of spirituality. Communes arose, Eastern religions spread, people experimented with psychedelics in search of enlightenment. Heaven's Gate was part of this broader cultural trend. By the 90s, the situation had changed, but the feeling of alienation and searching hadn't disappeared. The internet appeared, which on one hand connected people, and on the other created new forms of isolation. Heaven's Gate adapted to these changes, using new technologies to spread their ideas. Today, almost 30 years later, the Heaven's Gate story is still studied, discussed, analyzed. It has become part of popular culture, mentioned in films, series, documentaries. The black clothing and Nike sneakers have become an iconic image, a symbol of blind faith and tragedy. But behind these images stand real people who lived real lives and made a real decision to die. Each of the 39 had their own story, their own reasons for joining the group, their own hopes and fears. We will never know all the details, what was happening in their minds in the last days, hours, minutes. We can only guess. What can be taken from this story? Perhaps the most important thing is understanding how fragile the human psyche can be, how much we need connection with other people, meaning, purpose, and how important it is to be careful with those who offer simple answers to complex questions, who promise salvation in exchange for complete submission. This is also a reminder of the importance of critical thinking, the need to maintain connections with the world outside any group to which we belong. When we isolate ourselves, when we surround ourselves only with those who think the same way we do, we become vulnerable to distorted perception of reality. Relatives and friends of those involved in such groups must also be vigilant. The signs can be subtle: growing isolation, personality changes, breaking of old connections, ever-increasing devotion to the group and its leader. But intervention must be delicate. Aggressive attempts to pull a person out of a cult often lead to the opposite effect, strengthening their belief that the outside world doesn't understand them. The Heaven's Gate story is not just a story about a strange cult and mass suicide. It's a story about the human need for meaning, about the power of faith, about how ordinary people can come to unusual beliefs. It's a story about charisma, manipulation, but also about sincerity, about people who truly believe they were making the right choice. On March 26th of each year, some people remember the 39 people who left this world in Rancho Santa Fe. They remember them not as victims of a mad cult, but as people with their own stories, their own families, their own dreams. People who were searching for something greater and, as it seemed to them, found it. The question that remains unanswered: did they find what they were looking for? From the point of view of science, materialism, common sense, the answer is obvious. They died, and that's all. There was no ship, no transition, no next level. But if you look through the eyes of a believer, a person who is convinced of the existence of something beyond the material world, the answer becomes less obvious. We live in a world where billions of people believe in life after death, in heaven, in reincarnation, in various forms of existence beyond physical reality. And most of these beliefs are based not on evidence, but on faith, on sacred texts, on the teachings of spiritual leaders. How is the faith of Heaven's Gate members different from the faith of a Christian who believes in resurrection, or a Buddhist who believes in nirvana? The difference, perhaps, is that Heaven's Gate members decided not to wait for natural death, but to actively bring closer the moment of transition. This activity, this decision to take their fate into their own hands, is what makes their case so shocking and controversial. In most religious traditions, suicide is considered a sin precisely because it's an attempt by a person to take on a role that belongs to God or fate. But Marshall Applewhite taught that their situation was unique, that they had received a special invitation, a special opportunity that couldn't be missed. Interestingly, in his teachings, do often refer to the story of Jesus. He said that Jesus also knew he had to die to complete his mission. He actively went toward his death, didn't resist it. Of course, Christian theology interprets this completely differently. Jesus' sacrifice was atonement for humanity's sins, not a way to leave the planet on a spacecraft. But for Heaven's Gate followers, this parallel made sense within their belief system. There's another point that's often overlooked. Some group members experienced doubts. Not everyone was absolutely certain of the correctness of the decision until the very end. There's evidence that several people left the group shortly before the mass suicide. They felt that something was wrong, that this was going too far. They were able to break out of the bubble of beliefs and see reality. One former member who left the group several years before the tragedy later told how he gradually began to doubt. He said the teaching was becoming increasingly extreme, increasingly detached from reality. Prophecies didn't come true. The spacecraft didn't arrive when promised. Each time a new explanation was found, a new date, a new condition. At some point, he realized he could spend his entire life waiting for something that would never happen. He left, restored connections with family, started a new life. When he heard about the suicide, he was shocked but not surprised. He knew where it was all heading, but not everyone could leave. Social pressure within the group was enormous. If you started to doubt, you were accused of not being strong enough, that your human mind was trying to sabotage your spiritual growth. Your partner, with whom you worked every day, had to report on your doubts. Leaving the group meant not just leaving a religious movement, it meant losing everything: your family, your friends, your identity, your purpose in life. For many, this was unthinkable. Psychologists call this phenomenon group dependency or collective identity. When your entire life revolves around the group, when all your social connections are within it, leaving becomes psychologically almost impossible. Even if rationally you understand that something is wrong, emotionally you can't imagine existence outside the group. This mechanism works not only in cults. We see it in toxic relationships, in corporate culture, in political movements, even in families. People stay in situations that harm them because they can't imagine an alternative, because their identity is too tied to this situation. In the case of Heaven's Gate, this mechanism was amplified by years of practice of renouncing individuality. Group members gave up their names, their personal belongings, their individual goals. They became part of a collective organism where the individual ego had to dissolve. When the time came to make the final decision, they simply had no part of their personality left that could say no, that could protect their survival instinct. Marshall Applewhite's role in this process was central, but it's difficult to evaluate unambiguously. On one hand, he was the leader who led his followers to death. On the other hand, he himself believed in what he preached so much so that he was ready to die first. He didn't send them to death. He went with them. In his last video messages, Marshall looks calm, even joyful. He talks about how long they've been preparing for this moment, how glad he is that it's finally happening. He thanks T for waiting for them, says they will soon reunite. In his words, there is no fear, no regret, only certainty and anticipation. Can he be called a villain? Or was he himself a victim of his beliefs? The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. He was a charismatic leader who had the ability to influence people. He created a belief system that justified suicide. He maintained an atmosphere of isolation and control. But at the same time, he sincerely believed in his mission. He didn't enrich himself, didn't exploit his followers sexually or physically. He simply believed in a crazy idea and took others with him. History knows many charismatic leaders who led their followers to tragic ends. Jim Jones and the People's Temple in Jonestown, where 900 people died as a result of mass suicide or murder in 1978. David Koresh and the siege in Waco, where 76 people died in 1993. Shoko Asahara and the Aum Shinrikyo sect, which carried out a gas attack in the Tokyo subway in 1995. All these cases have common features. A charismatic leader who claims to possess special knowledge or connection with higher powers. An isolated group of followers who break ties with the outside world. Gradual escalation of demands and extreme practices. Apocalyptic beliefs about the end of the world or imminent catastrophe. And ultimately, a tragic finale. But there are also differences. Jim Jones was a paranoid drug addict in his last years of life. He ruled his commune with an iron fist, applied physical and psychological violence. In Jonestown, people were virtually imprisoned, surrounded by armed guards. When the time came for mass suicide, many had to be coerced, and some were simply killed. David Koresh accumulated weapons, had sexual relations with underage girls, declared himself the Messiah. His group died as a result of a standoff with federal authorities, a fire that was possibly set intentionally. Heaven's Gate differed from these cases. There was no violence, no coercion in the usual sense. Group members could leave, and some did leave. There was no accumulation of weapons, no preparation for armed confrontation. Just a group of people living together, working, following strange rules, waiting for a spacecraft. Perhaps that's why the Heaven's Gate case is so disturbing. If this were a story about a mad tyrant who forcibly held people and eventually killed them, it would be understandable. Evil crime victims. But Heaven's Gate is a story about people who voluntarily, calmly, methodically decided to commit suicide, believing it was the right decision. This makes us think about the nature of free will, about how free our decisions really are when we're under the influence of strong beliefs and social pressure. Philosophers have long argued about free will. Some claim that free will is an illusion, that all our decisions are predetermined by our biology, upbringing, circumstances. Others insist that a person has a fundamental ability to make choices, regardless of external factors. The Heaven's Gate case is somewhere in this gray zone. Group members technically made a choice. No one held a gun to their heads. But this choice was made in the context of years of indoctrination, isolation, psychological pressure. Was it really a free choice? Legally, of course, suicide is not a crime in most jurisdictions. Assisting suicide is another matter, and after the Heaven's Gate tragedy, there were discussions about whether anyone could be held responsible. But all the main participants were dead. The few former members who survived didn't participate in the planning or execution. There was no one who could be accused. This, too, is part of what makes this story so unsatisfying. There's no villain who can be punished. There's no justice that can be restored. There's only death, grief, and unanswered questions. The families of the deceased founded support groups, trying to help each other cope with the loss. Some became activists, warning about the dangers of cults. They visited schools, universities, told their stories, explained the signs to look out for. They tried to extract at least some meaning from the tragedy to prevent a recurrence of something similar in the future. But cults haven't disappeared. They continue to exist, adapting to the changing society. In the internet age, new forms of influence and control have emerged. Online communities can create the same mechanisms of isolation and group identity as physical cults. Conspiracy theories, extremist ideologies, pseudoscientific movements, they all use similar tactics for recruiting and retaining people. There are communities on the internet where people encourage each other to commit suicide, exchange methods, create pacts. There are groups that believe in various apocalyptic scenarios and prepare for the end of the world. There are movements that deny science, medicine, reality, creating alternative belief systems isolated from the mainstream. The mechanisms that led to the Heaven's Gate tragedy are still active in our society, perhaps even more active in the age of social media, when algorithms create echo chambers where people see only information confirming their beliefs. When it's easy to find a community of people who think the same way you do, even if these thoughts are radical or dangerous. What can we do to prevent similar tragedies in the future? Education and critical thinking is one answer. Teaching people to ask questions, verify information, recognize manipulation. But that's not enough. Heaven's Gate members were not uneducated people. Many of them were smart, educated professionals. Critical thinking can fail when emotional needs are strong enough. Perhaps more important is creating a society where people don't feel so lost and isolated that they have to seek meaning in extreme groups. Where traditional institutions, family, community, religion, provide enough support and meaning. Where people have purpose, connections, a sense of belonging without needing to join a cult. But this is easier said than done. Modern society, with its individualism, mobility, fragmentation, creates conditions for alienation. We live in a world where you can be surrounded by millions of people and still feel absolutely alone. Where traditional sources of meaning, religion, national identity, family ties, are weakening and new ones haven't fully formed yet. Heaven's Gate arose in this vacuum of meaning. It offered an answer to the question, what will happen to me after death? Is there something in the universe greater than my little life on this planet? For 39 people, this answer was convincing enough to die for it. We can consider them naive, deluded, victims of manipulation. And all of this will be true. But there were also people searching for something important, something that gives life meaning. In this search, they're not unique. We all search for meaning, all try to understand our place in the universe. The difference is in what answers we find and how far we're willing to go for these answers. The Heaven's Gate story is an extreme case, but it reflects universal human needs and vulnerabilities. The need for belonging, understanding, purpose that's greater than ourselves. Vulnerability to charismatic leaders, convincing narratives, group pressure. The ability of the human mind to create and believe in the most incredible stories if they give us what we're looking for. In a certain sense, each of us lives in our own belief system that's not fully based on objective reality. We believe in things we can't prove, love, morality, the meaning of life, the value of human existence. We create narratives about ourselves and the world that help us cope with existential anxiety. Most of these beliefs don't lead us to suicide, but they're still forms of faith, not absolute knowledge. Heaven's Gate members took this logic to the extreme. They created a belief system that promised them transcendence, liberation from the limitations of human existence. and they were willing to pay the ultimate price for the realization of these beliefs. Can we condemn them? Can we sympathize with them? Probably both. We can regret what they did, the lives that were lost, the pain they caused their loved ones. And at the same time, we could try to understand the human need that stood behind their decision, recognize that in other circumstances, any of us could be vulnerable to similar ideas. On March 26th, 1997, 39 people went to sleep believing they would wake up in a new world aboard a spacecraft heading for the stars. They didn't wake up. There was no ship, no next level, no tea waiting for them. There was only death, silence, and an empty mansion in California. Their story remained as a warning, as a tragedy, as a mystery of human nature. It reminds us of the power of faith, the danger of isolation, the importance of critical thinking. But it also reminds us of our common humanity, our striving for meaning, our vulnerability, and how easily we can get lost in the search for answers to eternal questions. I'll stop here. Thank you for being with us on the Fear Files channel. If this story made you think, share the video, leave a comment. And remember, in the search for meaning, it's important not to lose touch with reality and with the people who love you. Until next time.